It was a chilly autumn's eve on December 1st, 1955, when Rosa Parks boarded a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. That day, the Civil Rights Movement was born. After a long and hectic workday as a department store seamstress, Rosa Parks took a seat in the back section reserved for colored people. As the bus traveled along its route, the rows began to fill up until there were no more seats available. At this point, a white man got on board and was left standing on the crowded bus. The bus driver stood up and ordered the people in the first colored rows to release their seats. All did except Rosa Parks, who did not move. The driver asked if she was going to stand or be arrested. Rosa felt determination cover her body like a quilt on a winter night. She looked out the window and quietly said, "You may do that." The bus remained still as the police were summoned. The sound of people's complaints began to fill the air, and several blacks left the bus. The police arrived and asked her why she did not stand up. She responded,
"Why are you always pushing us around?"
With those defiant words, the Civil Rights Movement was born. Rosa Parks believed all people were equal, but our society at the time did not agree. The history of legal discrimination against African Americans in the United States was as old as the country itself. It was not until the Reconstruction period after the Civil War ended in 1865 that slavery was finally outlawed. Shortly thereafter, the United States passed constitutional amendments that granted African American citizenship and forbade states from passing discriminatory black code laws. The 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution have profoundly affected the course of America by providing due process of law for everyone. In spite of these constitutional protections, throughout the next 20 years, the Southern states imposed new restrictions to deny rights for African Americans, and so-called Jim Crow laws began to flourish. Named after a popular minstrel song, these laws mandated separate public and private facilities for whites and blacks. Racial segregation was put into effect throughout the South. The Jim Crow laws meant that African Americans had to attend separate schools, eat at separate restaurants, drink from separate water fountains, and ride in the back of the bus. It was commonly understood that public meant whites only. Black people were forbidden from public libraries, swimming pools, parks, and playgrounds, and restricted from working certain jobs, serving on juries, or giving court testimonies. They were told what kind of clothes to wear. In some places, they were told what make and model car to drive. In other places, allowed only used cars. They were not permitted to share the sidewalk with a white person or even to look them in the eye, as they could be sent to jail for assault by reckless eyeballing. This was the world where Rosa Parks lived. Rosa Louise McCauley was born February 4, 1913, in Tuskegee, Alabama. As a child, she was small and frail, but had a sharp mind and learned to read at a very young age. When her parents separated, she moved with her mother to Montgomery. There she was raised in an extended family that included her maternal grandparents, aunt, and younger brother. Montgomery, Alabama was a segregated community and not very hospitable to blacks. Rosa's grandparents had been slaves, and she was very aware of the unfair treatment they received. Raised to be proud of who she was, Rosa hated having to drink from separate water fountains and not being able to eat at the whites-only restaurants. And then there was the bus. Rosa hated riding the segregated buses so much she often walked.
I'd see the bus pass every day, but to me, that was a way of life. We had no choice but to accept what was the custom. The bus was among the first ways I realized there was a black world and a white world.
As she grew up in Montgomery, Rosa became a member of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, also called the AME Church. She was schooled at home until the age of 11, and in 1924 she enrolled in the Montgomery Industrial School for Girls. All the students were African Americans, and the teachers were all women from the North. There, along with her general studies, she was also taught domestic servant skills. Her family could not afford to pay for the private school, so Rosa helped clean classrooms in exchange for her tuition. What she learned best, however, was that she was a person of dignity and self-respect, and she could not set her sights lower than anyone else because she was black. Rosa felt that no human being should ever be treated unjustly, but should be judged by the respect they have for themselves and others. Rosa eventually left school to take care of her ailing grandmother and later her mom. One day in 1932, when she was 19, she and her friends stepped into a barber shop to keep dry from the rain. Rosa had grown into a lovely young woman, and she caught the eye of a barber named Raymond Parks. Raymond was an immaculate dresser, handsome and very charming. Rosa initially resisted him because of his light-colored skin, but Raymond was a persistent suitor and eventually persuaded her to accept a date. By the end of the year, she was his wife. Raymond was an intelligent, well-read man, and he encouraged Rosa to finish school. With his support, she went back to high school and earned her diploma. Raymond Parks was also very active in a civil rights organization called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP. Founded in 1909, the NAACP was a group of professional black and white community leaders who concentrated on using the legal system to overcome Jim Crow laws. They became a national presence in the fight against the murder of blacks by lynching. One of Rosa Parks' worst childhood memories was the ever-constant fear of being lynched, and she joined Raymond in his support of the NAACP. At the local Montgomery chapter, she was elected secretary to President Edgar Daniel E.D. Nixon, a prominent black community leader. As a youth director for the NAACP, Rosa guided young children to protest peacefully at the city's main library, which at the time made fewer books available to blacks. She became a mentor to the young black community of Montgomery, who looked to her for guidance and advice. Although Rosa was a diminutive-looking woman, her small frame and polite manner concealed her iron-strength will. Her family had instilled in her a determination for equality and respect, and she did not back down from the oppression she and others of her race faced on a daily basis. One widely felt form of discrimination was the public bus system. In Montgomery, the first 4 rows of buses were reserved for white people. In the back were colored sections for black people, who made up more than 75% of the riders. These sections were not fixed in size, but determined by the placement of a movable sign. Black people could also sit in the middle rows until white people needed those seats. Then they were required to move to seats in the rear, stand, or leave the bus. The bus driver who carried a gun to enforce the rules could move the sign as he needed or remove it altogether. If white people were already on the bus, blacks could enter to pay their fare, but then had to disembark and use the rear entrance. There were times when the bus would depart before they could make it back on. The NAACP was determined to confront these policies and needed a good-standing citizen's example to use for a case. Rosa Parks' arrest on the bus became the perfect example. Rosa was driven to the police station and charged with a violation of the Chapter 6, Section 11 segregation law of the Montgomery City Code. She was booked, fingerprinted, and jailed, unable to call anyone to say where she was. Fortunately, word had spread around town about what happened, and a friend soon notified her family. Raymond Parks attempted to phone the police station and was cut off. He quickly alerted E.D. Nixon. Nixon decided to contact attorney Cliff Durr, who was a longtime supporter and friend. Mr. Durr agreed to take on Rosa's case, and together they bailed her out of jail. That evening, Nixon persuaded Rosa to allow her case to be used to challenge the city's bus segregation policy. She agreed to fight the charges despite Raymond's warning, "Rosa, the white folks will kill you." While they were discussing Rosa's case on the night of her arrest, E.D. Nixon and his advisors decided that a one-day boycott of the Montgomery bus system by the black community would give emphasis to the legal battle they were about to embark. They drew up a list of prominent black leaders from Montgomery for support and began to put together a plan of action. 4 days later, Rosa Parks was tried on charges of disorderly conduct and violating a local ordinance. The trial lasted 5 minutes. She was found guilty and fined $10 plus $4 in court costs. Rosa appealed her conviction and formally challenged the legality of racial segregation.
I had not planned to get arrested. All I was doing was trying to get home from work. I had plenty to do without having to end up in jail. But when I had to face that decision, I didn't hesitate to do so because I felt that we had endured that too long. The more we gave in, the more we complied with that kind of treatment, the more oppressive it became.
90% of the black community participated and stayed off the buses that day, prompting calls for boycott leaders to harness the momentum into a larger protest campaign. After the trial, a meeting was held at the Mount Zion AME Church. A committee was established called the Montgomery Improvement Association. The mission extended beyond the boycott campaign as it sought to improve the general status of Montgomery, to improve race relations and eliminate every vestige of discrimination. A young minister was chosen to be their leader. He was new to the community, but had remarkably gifted public speaking skills with magnetic delivery. His name was Martin Luther King Jr. Several thousand black citizens attended a church meeting later that night and unanimously agreed to continue the boycott until they were able to ride the bus without Jim Crow rules. Word was spread through church announcements, leaflets passed by hand, and a front-page article in the Montgomery Advisor. The winter rain was cold and brutal, but 40,000 people walked, rode in carpools, or took special cabs that charged the same fares as the bus. Many rides secretly came from white women whose primary interest was getting their maids and housekeepers to work. The black community united in a mass movement that marked one of the largest and most successful challenges of racial segregation, and it catapulted Martin Luther King Jr. to the forefront of the civil rights movement. The boycott continued into 1956. The lack of business in the bus system and the publicity of the boycott began to take an economic toll on the city of Montgomery. During that time, reactionaries within the local white communities retaliated against the protesters in a variety of ways. Police harassed carpoolers, and Reverend King was arrested on a petty speeding offense. The violence reached a new height one day when a bomb exploded at the house of Martin Luther King Jr. while his wife and 2-month-old baby were inside. Dr. King rushed home from a church meeting as soon as he heard the news. Upon arrival, he learned that no one had been hurt, but a crowd of boycott supporters surrounding the house were furious and ready to fight. Dr. King remained calm and redirected the crowd's focus back to their cause. E.D. Nixon's house and many black churches were also attacked. Still, the black community persevered under the guidance of Dr. King and his message of peaceful resistance. On November 13, 1956, the United States Supreme Court outlawed racial segregation on public transportation, deeming it unconstitutional. The court order arrived in Montgomery on December 20th, and after 381 days, the bus boycott ended. That day, Rosa Parks took her seat at the front of the bus. The Montgomery bus boycott was a very significant event in the history of the civil rights movement, which spanned the 1950s and 60s. The protest caught the attention of the entire nation because of its massive scale and length of time. Furthermore, it was important because it set the tone for the whole civil rights movement and gave Martin Luther King Jr. a position of leadership that showed a nonviolent method of protest could be effective.
As I look back on those days, it's just like a dream. The only thing that bothered me was that we waited so long to make this protest and to let it be known wherever we go that all of us should be free and equal and have all the opportunities that others should have.
After her arrest, Rosa Parks became an icon of the civil rights movement, but she suffered hardship as a result. She and her husband Raymond both lost their jobs and received numerous death threats. In 1957, the family moved to Detroit to escape the shrinking opportunities of Montgomery, and also the clash of egos left in the wake of the boycott. Many people wanted to take credit for the success of the protests, but Rosa remained unpretentious, quiet, and serene. In Detroit, she resumed her work as a seamstress until 1965, when Congressman John Conyers Jr. hired her as an office aide. That same year, Rosa traveled through rural Alabama to recruit new voters under the recently passed Voter Rights Act that was enacted by Congress in response to hundreds of black and white students fighting for voter registration in Freedom Summer 1964. Rosa also continued her inspirational work with children and young adults. In 1987, Rosa co-founded the Rosa and Raymond Parks Institute for Self-Development in honor of her late husband. The Institute organizes Pathways to Freedom bus tours, which introduce students to important civil rights and Underground Railroad sites throughout the United States. For 10 years, Rosa rode with the students on their journey, and after that, met them at various points along the way. Although she never had children of her own, Rosa was often called Mother Parks because of her support and inspiration as a youth mentor. Later in her life, Rosa received many awards for her historic achievements. In 1996, President Bill Clinton presented to her the U.S. Executive Branch's highest honor, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. The next year, she was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the nation's highest civilian honor. 2 years after that, she was a guest of President Clinton during his 1999 State of the Union address.
Since 1997, our initiative on race has sought to bridge the divides between and among our people. In its report last fall, the initiative's advisory board found that Americans really do want to bring our people together across racial lines. We know it's been a long journey. For some, it goes back to before the beginning of our republic. For others, back since the Civil War. For others, throughout the 20th century. But for most of us alive today, in a very real sense, this journey began 43 years ago, when a woman named Rosa Parks sat down on a bus in Alabama and wouldn't get up. She's sitting down with the First Lady tonight, and she may get up or not as she chooses. We thank her.
Rosa Parks lived her last years peacefully, continuing her work with the Institute for Self-Development and making public appearances for as long as she could. When she died on October 24, 2005, at the age of 92, the nation mourned but also celebrated her life. Rosa Parks became the first woman in American history to be laid in repose at the Capitol Rotunda in Washington, D.C., an honor usually reserved for presidents, military leaders, and politicians. Dignitaries and hundreds of thousands of ordinary people commemorated her courageous life. In Montgomery, the sun shined brightly through the stained glass windows at the St. Paul AME Church as hundreds gathered inside to honor Rosa Parks and vowed to continue her message of equality and freedom.